There are four major methods of personality assessment. You want to be familiar with what these four are, the different types of tests that they might include, and also be familiar with what type of person is most likely to use them, because the type of personality assessment that you use in large part has to do with which of the four personality perspectives you believe is more true or more valid. So we'll start with the first one. The first type of personality assessment is the interview. Everybody's been through an interview before, because interviews aren't just the ones we formally call interviews, but it's anytime you're talking with someone in a way where they're trying to learn about your personality. So anytime you make a friend or go on a first date or introduce yourself in class, that's an interview. It can be a very good way to get specific information about a person. So interview is one method of personality assessment. A second method are behavioral assessments. Now, behavioral assessments, not surprisingly, are used by people operating from the behaviorist perspective, and they aren't really concerned with what you have to say. They're concerned with what you do. So someone who's giving a behavioral assessment is not really going to ask you questions. They're going to put you in situations or scenarios where they're actually seeing how you're behaving. So direct observation is an example of a behavioral assessment. A frequency count is an example of a behavioral assessment. Don't tell me what you're going to do or what you're like. Show me. The third type are personality inventories. Now, personality inventories are more commonly used by trait theorists. And again, trait theory is all about identifying shared characteristics or traits and then predicting what types of jobs, relationships will be desirable for those individuals. There's many different personality inventories, but the NEOPI, which is the one we use to do a lot of research with the Big Five factor model of personality, the NEOPI is an example of a personality inventory. Probably the most commonly used personality inventory is the MMPI, which stands for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. If you know it's MMPI, PI stands for Personality Inventory, you know what type of assessment it is, and you also know what type of theorists would use it. So very helpful to learn what that means. And then finally we have projective tests. Projective tests are used by psychoanalysts or people operating from the psychodynamic perspective. Because remember, this perspective says that what's really affecting your personality are things that are not on your immediately recalled conscious. These are unconscious things we need to access. So projective tests try to get at some kind of hidden or accidental answer that you give. There's two very important projective tests you'll want to be familiar with. The first is the Rorschach. If you're a fan of Watchmen, there's a character called Rorschach. Basically, Rorschach just means ink blot. This is the ink blot test. So you show someone a series of these ink blots, which are nothing. They're just random pictures. And then you ask someone what they see. And then you take their answers, you compare them to a whole lot of other people who've answered that way. And let's say I show you an ink blot and you say, that looks like a cow. And I might look in my manual and go, wow, people that say cow are very likely to have schizophrenia. I'm making that up, but that's the idea, is that you take someone's answer and you say, well, it might make them more likely to have this type of concern. The idea is you are projecting things onto this image because there's nothing in the actual pictures. It's all coming from your unconscious, according to this perspective. The second projective test is the TAT, which stands for Thematic Apperception Test. Again, this is another projective test, but the TAT is a series of scenarios, of pictures of people in situations. And the subject is asked to tell a story about what is happening in the picture. So again, most of the pictures are pretty bland, but whatever story someone creates, the idea is that they're revealing things about themselves by describing this story. Projective tests are pretty low in reliability and validity compared to some of the others, which means they're not always measuring what they claim to. And a lot of people are very skeptical about their use. Even people that use them don't just use them. They use them in addition to other methods. The TAT actually is very good with one population, that's children, because children usually will describe their world through stories. That's kind of how they're used to talking about things. So make sure you know all four of those personality assessments. Make sure you know interviews, behavioral assessments, personality inventories, and projective tests. Make sure you're familiar with the examples that I gave you, and also be familiar with what type of theorists would use those assessments.